and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to the unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared: Tadyata gate gate paragate parasam gate bodhi svaha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. And then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma. May I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Yeah, welcome back, everybody. So last time I presented the idea that the overview framework for this series of talks is going to be the idea of three different Buddhist visions of ultimate reality, three different Buddhist visions of the profound reality. And I talked quite a bit about kindness and how the whole idea of meditating on emptiness is aimed at making us become as skillful as possible at actually being effective in our kindness towards other living beings. When we have attachment to rigid ideas about who we are and how other people exist, and how what is the absolute right way or wrong way to interact with them, then we have hindrances in terms of the fluidity or the responsiveness or the attunement we can have in responding to the needs of others. So meditating on emptiness, this is a point I was trying to get across, I guess, is that, opens up the possibilities for our becoming, not necessarily in itself making us more kind, but making us more effective in the practice of kindness, right? That was the general idea for last time. So I'm going to run a PowerPoint today in which we'll just take, not going to go through all the slides from last time, but I'll just show you the basic three views. And then we'll continue as we did last time to explore the first of those three views, which is the view that Tsongkhapa regards as the highest one, right? The highest one. And I probably will spend the rest of this class and maybe part of the next class on that. And then after that, we'll take a look at the other two views. And then maybe that will leave room, at the end of these sessions to come back to reflect on how, Tsongkhapa's approach to looking at or treating these other perspectives that he doesn't consider the highest. Okay, so I'm going to share my PowerPoint here. Yeah, so this is, I just moved this slide down. This is the sort of table of contents slide from last time. 3 ways of talking to guide people toward liberating vision of the profound reality. Yeah, 3 ways of talking, 3 ways of thinking about it. Ultimately, direct liberating experience, direct liberating vision of truth just as it is something that's ineffable, transcends the ability to be expressed perfectly in words and concepts. And so then to some extent, I argued last time, different ways of talking about ultimate reality can be different, can be the best medicine for different people at different times under the root medical metaphor of Buddhism, that Buddha is the doctor, the Dharma is the medicine. Because Buddha is a good doctor, there's lots of different medicines in the Dharma pharmacy to treat the particular particular configuration of, mental capacities and types of hindrances that each individual being has. So, right, it's with rare exception throughout the Buddhist world, most Buddhists will accept that there are other valid Buddhist teachings besides the one that they consider the highest. And they accept those as good medicine that's part of the Buddha's teaching that's helpful for some people. Okay, so in Tsongkhapa's view, the highest or the sort of final view of the profound reality is this idea that profound reality is a lack or an absence. It's a negation in things and people of a distorted kind of existence that is in fact completely impossible, has never existed, never could exist, this kind of existence. So emptiness or no self, this lack, is the most profound reality, even though it's a sheer negation, because it's the absence of something that we have beginninglessly, continuously superimposed over the top of the world and thereby been enmeshed in cycles of needless suffering. And then there's also the view that the profound liberating reality should not be defined in such negative terms, but rather should be thought about in terms of a fundamentally pure Buddha nature that's primordially present within all beings, okay? And then there's also the perspective that the profound reality is not accessible to words and thoughts at all. It's ineffable, transcends all dualistic categories, and you can't really, if you talk about it in terms of primordial perfection, you may be falling to, according to this view, a kind of reifying extreme, making ultimate reality more substantive and eternal than it is. And on the other hand, if you define it as Tsongkhapa does as a negation, then that's seen as a kind of nihilism, in the sense that it's saying that the ultimate reality of things is negative. And some Tibetan Buddhists, who are not in Tsongkhapa's tradition, criticize Tsongkhapa's tradition for that. Okay, so that's not what we're going to be talking about today, but we will come to that. So before we go on with what I'm going to do today, which is try to have some quotes from Tsongkhapa and lay out his view, just remember that this delusion or ignorance is a superimposition or adding on to how things actually exist of something extra. And that's why the word that Tsongkhapa uses to talk about ultimate reality is emptiness. It's a negation because it's a corrective subtraction within our minds of something extra that we falsely imposed on top of things as they actually are. So, in fact, if you read Tsongkhapa in Tibetan, he does use the word emptiness quite a bit, but the word he uses most often is tekonani, which means just thatness, things just as they are, suchness, sometimes people have translated it. So it means things devoid of any kind of extra superimposition that we've put on top of it. So you see, to see things, we suffer needlessly because we don't see things as they are. To see things as they are, the problem is not to see in some extra stuff that's not there. The problem is that we're already adding some extra layers of stuff that isn't there. And so in order to be liberated, we have to, realize a negation of this extra. So that last time I just, used this idea of ontological mayonnaise, like in other words, there's the basic equipment of the sandwich, and then there's something extra that's been slathered on top of it. And that's, our projection of a sense of inherent existence on top of things that do exist, but don't exist inherently or by way of their own nature. And this extra that we add on top of things is not trivial or harmless. It's the whole basis of cyclic existence. It's the growth medium for greed and hatred and anger. That is, when we see things in this distorted way, it provides like the perfect growth medium for all of the other mental afflictions. In the Prasangika way, which is, you know, the way of Chandrakirti, that's the way that's followed by Tsongkhapa, they don't understand delusion or ignorance as being something that's like separate from anger or hatred or fear or greed. It's like when you have a moment of greedy attachment, this is infused with delusion. It's like delusion and this greedy mind are right there together, and your greediness for something is associated with a projection into the object of the greed of some kind of intrinsic graspability, right? So like when the pizza comes and you're really hungry, why do people burn their mouths? Is because there's this moment of seeing the pizza not just as something that will nourish them or will have a good taste, but seeing something, seeing it as intrinsically desirable, right? Not just good to eat, but intrinsically desirable, and therefore it's kind of a shock when it burns the roof of your mouth. And there's like so many other examples, right? You can use all the different sexual misconduct examples, all the different road rage examples, all the different wars in the history of the world. They all work in terms of, you know, this projecting this exaggerated status on top of things, and that's serving as the growth medium for these other afflictions that lead to harmful actions. I just stuck these words in here today. Like, so when my teacher at University of Virginia was Jeffrey Hopkins, and he liked to talk about this in terms of how when he was raised during the Cold War, the Russians were intrinsically evil. that he could not think, when he thought about the Russians over there and how evil and communist they were, it just seemed like that. How could these people possibly be? They were like the spawn of Satan, right? And how could they be so horrible? So he didn't actually know any Russians, but he just knew that there was this huge extra layer of projection on top of Russians as intrinsically bad. Or you could say projection on top of them. It's projection on top of our image of them, but there's a feeling almost that it's like they're bad from the inside. We've projected it to their inner nature to be intrinsically evil, right? And you can do the same thing with kind of romantic Orientalism or racism, where so many, right, all the different isms they're involved this kind of projection of some extra status that's not actually there, but we project it on top of things and then leads to problems. So that's an analogy, right? It's not the same thing, but it's a comparison of how there's a projection by the mind of something extra that causes a problem, right? And so I already said this. The idea of emptiness as a negative is crucial. Like my students have said to me, it's like, if emptiness means is that everything's connected and nothing exists by itself, but everything's connected to everything else, why don't we just call it fullness instead? Wouldn't that be a better marketing plan? Because emptiness is kind of a bummer, and fullness, would sound better. Like everything's full of everything else. And right. So yeah, I could see their point, right? And this is always something you write about emptiness. Is one of the things you always have to talk about is like, well, why is it called that? Right. And this is why. It's because the fundamental problem is our superimposition of something extra. So it's like thinking, projecting false characteristics onto something that lead to problems. So liberation comes through a subtraction of that extra projection. So part of what I'm going to do today, or a lot of the focus of today this evening, is to try to say exactly what is that projection as clearly as we can. And I ran these quotes last time because I like the Vajira Sutra, sutta from the Pali Canon, where you see the Bhikkhuni Vajira, expressing in the Pali Canon, her understanding of emptiness, that Mara approaches her, desiring to arouse fear or terror in her, and addresses these questions. By whom has this being been created? Who are you? Who are you really? Who made you? How did you get here? What is your real nature? How do you come into being and how do you go out of being? And as though there were some real nature in her that she could pin down and know, and yet has been unable to do so, right? Is this the sort of a profound identity, trying to provoke a profound identity crisis. And she recognizes him and says, why do you think there's a real being here? Are you grasping at or attached to a view? In fact, what is here is a heap of constructions. There isn't any being that can be found. So it isn't that there isn't any being at all, but there isn't any being that can be found or pinned down. It's like when there's a whole bunch collection of parts, we use the word chariot. So there is a chariot, but the chariot exists just in the sense that it's something that we find it useful to call certain kinds of collections of parts, right? And like that, when you have the mental and physical aggregates present, that it's useful to say there's a living being, right? Right, and so that is the sense in which there are living beings, and that is the sense in which there are chariots. And we're like, well, there must be something more real than that. Well, that's the whole point in Prasanga, because there isn't anything more real than that. Whether you dig down to the smallest atoms or you go back to the beginning of time, everything is merely designated or merely a convention. So the emptiness, the E word. Last time I spent a lot of time talking about how I preferred kindness to compassion. And I wrote this book, right, called Introduction to Emptiness. So I've been invited to different centers to talk about emptiness. And I realized that one of the problems with that is that then people start thinking about, look, I understand a lot of things about Buddhism and I like what I'm understanding, but then there's this other thing that I don't get called emptiness, as like it's some other extra thing that's kind of mysterious on top of how things exist or, what I'm learning. And that seems like a problem. And I think that's why, in Introduction to Tantra, Lama Yeshe talks so much about, it's like dependent arising, looking at things which awe us, either in terms of their overwhelming self-evident terribleness or their overwhelming self-evident goodness, and stopping and remembering, what are the collections of causes and conditions through which these came to be here, and like seeing that these just keep ramifying out and out and out and out and out. So that they're the appearance of something that's like, that looks like and forcefully presses itself on the mind of just being naturally present or naturally good or naturally intrinsically bad, right, is a deceptive appearance. And we can get at that deceptiveness by reflecting on interconnectedness of things. Another way to say this is that if you meditate on emptiness and you start to make some progress, you realize that it's not about taking your mind away from tables and who am I, or what does it mean for something to exist as a wall or a door, or it's really, emptiness is just talking about inviting us to think about how these things exist. It's not something else. It's just talking about how do these things really ultimately exist? Is there some way in which we're fundamentally confused about the way that these things exist. So if you pay attention to emptiness, it draws you much more deeply into, or it makes you more attentive, or yeah. I don't know, they use the word in Tibetan, pakyur, which means sort of like conscientious, or yeah, mindfully attentive of the particularities of things, because you're looking at them and saying, okay, how does that really work? How do all those parts come together to cause there arise in my mind this idea that there's some singular, unitary, objective thing called a wall there, and so forth, right? And instead of taking you out of space and time, it makes you more deeply engaged with it. And the same with other people too. So because things and persons exist, they don't have any way of existing on their own. So all things lack inherent existence or an intrinsic nature that, you know, on the basis of which they're established. And so therefore they exist only. This is an important thing. It's not just that things exist in dependence on parts, or things arise in time and dependence on causes, but they have no other way to exist, right? So this is like important, is like that people think, oh yeah, all Buddhists believe in dependent arising. I don't know that there's any Buddhists who don't believe in dependent arising. But a lot of times people think of it as all these things are interrelated, right? And that's how they exist, is that they exist in a mesh or a web of interrelationship. And then we stop there. But it's missing the emptiness part. It's missing the negation. It's missing, the point is that these things don't exist at all, except insofar as they're interrelated. And then you're like, oh, well, how would they be related if they didn't already exist? How could they hook up and form connections if they weren't already there in the first place, right? So we're implicitly assuming when we talk about dependent arising a lot of the time, or, you know, web of ecology, or the net of Indra, a lot of times there's behind that a reifying assumption that the individual elements that are forming connections are already there in the first place, and that's why they can connect, right? But there isn't any first place. There isn't any bottom, you know, to the chain of interconnectedness or interdependence. Nothing exists except insofar as it's dependent on causes, on parts, and ultimately, which we're going to get to talking about today, independence on a mind or a perspective that finds it useful or convenient, appropriate to designate something as this or that. And we'll come back to that. So we tell you emptiness is the ultimate truth, because why? Because when you search for the final nature of things, and you don't just say, is this a cat or is this a hat? But if you say, what is a cat really? What is it really? Let's look into this more deeply. What exactly do we mean by salad? You know, when we say salad, what is a salad exactly? What is a potato? You know, what is a car? And as you investigate, not just simply accepting, oh yeah, we already know it's a word and we know how to use it. Yeah, it's a word and you know how to use it. But what is there behind it that like constitutes its essence and nature? And it's like a lot of times you talk to people and they just definitely assume that since we use word for things, there must be real things that are set up objectively in the world that have some nature that corresponds to those words. And like, for example, the word religion, we ought to be able to find objectively which things have an objective nature that matches up to the word religion and which ones don't. And I find this mind-boggling sometimes, because I never think about it like that at all. It's like, these are all words and we find it, you know, sometimes convenient to use them in certain ways, right? And that way we can communicate with each other. But they're not like connected by way of to some intrinsic nature that's there in the object. And we tend to think like that implicitly. So when you ask this deeper question, when you sort of press on things and say, who am I really, right? What is the real nature of the car? I know I can see it out there in the driveway, but, you know, like, let's look into that more closely. Then we can't pin it down. the things and persons that we talk about and that exist, they can't be found when they're searched for in the sense of like, well, what is it really? What is its ultimate nature? It's because they don't have an essential nature or ultimate nature of their own. That's what it means to be empty, right? So the ultimate nature of things is that this emptiness, which is the only thing that the mind rests with at the end of a search, you know, for the essential nature of a thing. I know some non-Gyaltpas will, you know, represent this as a paradox, that the ultimate nature of things is that they have no nature. In a Gyaltpa way, you know, in Tsongkhapa way, you will want to say, oh, you can say the ultimate nature of things is that they have no nature, but the word nature means, you know, different things in the different part of the sentence, so it's not a contradiction. But some people, you know, you could express it that way, yeah. So yeah, when we look for things, we can't ultimately pin them down. Dalai Lama has, I think he might come from Nagarjuna, actually. The Dalai Lama likes to quote this idea that if things had some essential nature of their own, then when we looked into them very closely and analytically, and we said, what are they really? That essential nature should become clearer and clearer and clearer. And everybody should be able to agree, absolutely, and pin it down, right? And in fact, when you start looking into, the more you look into the question of, you know, who is Shakespeare, or who am I, right? Or what is religion? You know, these things quickly get very complicated and murky, and you get to the point of understanding that there isn't really any single thing you can pin down and point out, right? And that's an indication, that's a clue that they don't really have an essential nature. Yeah. So does it mean that things don't exist? This is actually, this second sentence here, it actually comes out of Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stage of the path to enlightenment, where he poses this as a rhetorical question to himself. How could a reasonable person say that things are completely unfindable under analysis when you search for them, and then still say that they exist? How can you, what, you know, if they existed, you ought to be able to find them when you look for them, right? That's what the problem he poses to himself. And he's saying, well, the fact that things are unfindable under an analysis that search for their ultimate nature doesn't mean that things don't exist. It means they don't exist in such a way as to be findable under that kind of analysis that searches for their real nature, because they exist, but they don't exist by way of some real nature that can be pinned down. Why did you think they did? Well, because you have delusion and ignorance, right? And that's what we are implicitly assuming. This process of meditating on emptiness, thinking about emptiness, is like this process of constantly catching ourselves, making the assumption that we ought to be able to find something there and then not being able to find it, right? It's like, yeah. So things exist, but they don't exist in the ways that we reflexively, unconsciously, implicitly tend to think they do, as, you know, something that can be pinned down at the end of your finger. Instead, they exist in a different, lighter, more open way. We see that tables and tables, I wrote, tables exist, but we've never actually seen tables as they are. It's weird to think about, right? It's like tables exist, we see tables, but we've never actually seen the table just as it is. We haven't ever seen the table denuded of this mayonnaise layer of extra superimposition that, you know, we're imposing upon it. So yeah, this criticism from some other traditions of Tibetan Buddhism is that, Gyaltsen's emphasis that the ultimate nature is emptiness makes the ultimate reality too much of a negative and is just a kind of an annihilation. It's an annihilationist extreme. But it's important to realize that emptiness is a negative, but it's not a non-existent. Negations exist. The absence of, the absence of Zoom bombers on this call right now, the absence of elephants here in the basement where I'm talking. These are real, real absences, right? Absences, lacks, or absences exist, right? And they make possible all kinds of activity. Like it would, right? For example, if we had a Zoom bomber, as I know some Dharma centers have, right? Then it becomes problematic to go on with the teaching, right? And if there were an elephant down here with me, I would also find that troubling, and so forth. So, and you can just keep thinking, there's so many examples like that. Most of the time, without thinking about it, we're able to do the things we do, not just because of what's there, because all the infinite number of things that are not there interfering with it, right? And so absences exist, and they make possible all different kinds of activities that we do. So you have to, think about the positive aspects of these absences. The lack of clouds and a clear sky is a traditional, way of thinking about it. Or the lack of bars on the window, right? The openness, lack of obstructedness, lack of rigidity. Things have emptiness is a way of saying that things have a clear, open, unobstructed nature. Their empty nature means that things are going to change, and they can change into anything that could possibly exist because they have no fixed nature of being however they're appearing at particular time to a particular person. So it means that, there's no essential difference between us and Buddhas right now. And there's no reason that we cannot be transformed into fully awakened Buddhas, because there's nothing essentially un-Buddha-like in our being, right? Because there is no essential nature in our being. Okay, so everything that exists is empty of its own self-nature. Said that. And emptiness exists. Therefore, emptiness itself is empty, right? Buddha is empty, Dharma is empty, spiritual assembly is empty, right? And emptiness is empty. That is, everything that exists by way of its interrelationship with perspectives and so forth. And you can't, ever pin down what it is in and of itself. So when people meditate on, what is the ultimate nature of themselves, or what is the ultimate nature of the chariot or the car, right? And their mind comes at last to emptiness, or this lack of absence of a graspable nature, right? And then some Buddhists in Tibet have concluded that therefore the one thing that must ultimately exist is emptiness, because it's what the ultimate mind, the mind that knows ultimate reality, the mind that knows the final nature of things, that mind is knowing emptiness, and therefore emptiness must be ultimately real. One thing that's ultimately real, some other Buddhists would say, is emptiness, because that's the one thing that a mind of ultimate analysis does finally find. Okay, so Tsongkhapa disagrees with that, right? Because he says, when you look at how does the chair exist, how does the car really exist, ultimately in analysis you'll find the emptiness of the chair, its unfindability. But that just means the chair is empty. It doesn't mean that emptiness itself exists. You haven't looked for the emptiness. When you say, okay, what about the emptiness of the chair that I've now realized? Does that emptiness, how can I pin down exactly what that emptiness is in and of itself? Emptiness is also unfindable under analysis because it doesn't exist in and of itself. The emptiness of the chair, for example, depends upon the chair. Right, we should understand that. And it also more, maybe more significantly, it depends on the point of view of a mind that realizes that a chair's unfindability under analysis and designates that as emptiness. So there isn't some self-existent ground of being called emptiness that is the one thing that's finally real. And that's how you can tell this is not Vedanta, right? It's different from Vedantic Hinduism or any other kind of monism. Because fundamentally, everything, everything is ultimately ungraspable, open, including that openness itself, right? So emptiness is a way of talking about how things exist. It doesn't exist apart from the things. It's a quality, or just like you don't have free floating redness, you have things have a quality of being red or big or something like that. And so a certain quality of how actually all things exist is that they have this quality of lacking any kind of self-existent nature, and that's their quality of being empty, right? So that's the supreme quality, right? The ultimate quality that's all pervasive, but it's an attribute of every individual object to which you turn your mind, and it's not something that exists apart from these conventional phenomena. So this is the profound point, I think, in Buddhism. Not that everything else is unreal in relationship to one thing that's real, but it's rather that nothing at all is real in and of itself. Things are real or exist only in relationship to other things. So there's the two truths, ultimate truth and conventional truth. Ultimate truth, as we were saying, is a way to talk about emptiness. And conventional truth, it refers to everything else that's not emptiness. I'm having a dog issue here. So tables, chairs, people, cars, these things are conventional truths. Emptiness of these things is ultimate truth. Does the emptiness of things discredit or undermine the existence of cars and tables and chairs? No. It's like things can be cars and chairs and tables only because they're empty, right? And because they exist, they're empty. And so the emptiness and the basis of that emptiness, the thing that has the quality of being empty, are always right there together. They don't contradict each other. It's not like, in the Tsongkhapa system, at least we have to say, it's very clear that it's not like one is higher than the other. In some other systems, maybe there is a sense that, when you see the ultimate truth, conventional things kind of don't really matter anymore and are realized to have been merely illusory. But that's not really the case here. Conventional phenomena exist, and ultimate truth is always right there together with them. When you have a yogi who goes into a deep meditation and only emptiness appears to her mind, right, and all other phenomena disappear, she's sort of switched channels from the way we are now, where we just see all these conventional things, but we're deluded about their emptiness. Well, you can go into this deep yogic state where only emptiness is appearing to your mind and no conventional phenomena appear at all. Conventional phenomena include people. How are you going to do good things to be effectively kind to people if you cannot see people, if your mind has no awareness of them, if you're completely absorbed in meditation on emptiness wholly and continuously, right, and no other conventional phenomena appear to you, then there isn't any giving and ethics and patience and effort necessary, right? That just like can be factored out of the path, because it's just all illusion and compared to the underlying reality or truth of emptiness. And so Tsongkhapa is very strongly against this idea, and the major thrust of his philosophy is to say we have to value and preserve, conventional truths and understand that they're not destroyed or wiped out or undermined by the truth of emptiness. It's what makes all of the existence of things possible, rather than what shows that these things are all not really here. So I try to think of different ways to express this. You can think of it as different levels of analysis, like, telling a truth about, my body in terms of physics, and then telling a whole different set of truths about it in terms of chemistry, and another set of truths about it in terms of biology. And all of these discourses are, seem disjunctive, and as though they're talking about different things, but they're really just describing exactly the same situation, but like from a different point of view, through a different channel of understanding. Or a different example, which actually comes originally from the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment, is thinking about it in terms of sense channels, like that you don't see sounds. We can't, right, normally, unless you have synesthesia or something, you don't see sounds no matter how carefully you look, but it doesn't mean that sounds aren't there. So, when the realization of emptiness doesn't mean that there aren't any conventional phenomena. It's just that you're looking in a way, which asks a question, is like, what is the ultimate nature of the potato? And of course it's going to be emptiness. And that doesn't answer the question of like, is this potato rotten? Is this potato good to eat, or should I save it for next year and plant it? These are important questions. We need to know, like, what would be a kind thing to do? And the kind thing and the unkind thing are both equally empty. So emptiness doesn't tell you everything you need to know to be effectively kind. In order to be effectively kind, you need to understand emptiness, but you also have to realize that understanding emptiness does not destroy, practical conventional distinctions. Yeah. So everything that we can name or point at or think of, that everything that exists, has an ultimate truth and a conventional truth, nature or aspect to it. So because everything is empty, right? And then there's this basis of emptiness. So there's a famous rabbit duck drawing from 19th century Germany or Austria. And it's like, there's many different versions of the rabbit duck. But this is like, a drawing that if you show it to children in the autumn, apparently in Germany, then people think it's a duck. And they're looking at the front of the animal being on the left. But if you show it to them in the spring, then most of the kids, thinking of Easter or whatever, they tend to see it as a rabbit and see the front of the animal pointing to the right. And of course, it's like you're looking at exactly the same shapes, the same configuration, but you're looking at it through a different interpretive lens. Whereas you're correctly seeing the form of a rabbit or correctly seeing the form of the duck in exactly the same place, depending on how you look, right? And so that's like my idea that we can be attuning ourselves to what's around us with our eyes or our ears, and in the same situation, the same space and time, we learn different things, right? And it's like that with seeing conventional reality, seeing ultimate reality. They're both important and necessary. Tsongkhapa says, well, if you're going to be a fully awakened Buddha and you're going to have the truth body, the Dharmakaya of a Buddha, then of course you have to realize emptiness. But on the other hand, there's the form bodies of Buddha, you know, the emanation bodies and the bliss bodies. And these come about only because of the practice of virtue along the path. And you're not going to be practicing virtue if every time you think about whether to do a virtuous action or not, you think, well, to do it is empty and not to do it is empty. So what the hell, right? Yeah. So this is a classic list, which I think I've said before about of 3 ways to think about how things exist interdependently. Wholes depend on parts, effects depends on conditions or causes, but everything depends upon imputation, the sense of being designated or I guess FPMT language, labeled by the mind as this or that. So Vasubandhu, in his 20 verses, points out famously that when gods look at a river, they see nectar. And when humans look at the same, you know, flowing liquid, they see water. But hungry ghosts who could be, you know, invisibly present, all these 3 beings could be present in the same place in the same time. And they would correctly see completely different things. How can that be? Well, it's because they have different karma, right? It's like their different karma gives them different, you know, physical and mental constituents, which cause this to appear. So from a human point on, it's like, obviously that's a river full of water, but these crazy, you know, hungry ghosts have such karmic obstructions that they see it as though it were pus and blood, but of course it's really water. No, that's not the case, right? Why would that's privileging the human karma, right? And it's not that it's intrinsically nectar or intrinsically water or intrinsically pus and blood. Every one of these beings is seeing the flowing liquid correctly relative to their point of view, and yet what they're seeing is contradictory. So how can that be? Vasubandhu says, well, what this proves is that there aren't any external objects at all. It's all, everything's in the mind of the perceiver. The object of, you know, pus and blood for the hungry ghost is arising, you know, as a fruition of the hungry ghost karma, you know, together with the mind that apprehends that within the mental continuum of the hungry ghost. And so, you know, there isn't some objective thing out there that we're talking about that can be at the same time 3 contradictory things. And that's, you know, making an argument for an idealist position or the mind only, you know, Chittamatra viewpoint. But Chandrakirti, the Prasangika point of view that Tsongkhapa follows, agrees that the world depends on mind. But at the same time, there are external objects that there are objects that are different entities from our consciousness. But the thing is, the way they depend on mind is they depend on being designated or imputed, ascribed as, or labeled as this or that, rather than that they're not built up as like on their own side over there from the back end, you know, as this or that by factors that exist out there apart from their mind. There are things that exist out there, but in order to say what they are, we have to consider the point of view, you know, say, is that nectar or is that water? Well, it depends on whose point of view you're talking about, right? There is something, there are lots of different things in the world, but to say what they are, you have to factor in the perspective of a viewer, right? So that's the way Chandrakirti does it. And that's what Tsongkhapa follows. And it's a little hard to get our minds around because, well, it is a challenge because how does the world really depend on mind if it exists out there apart from the mind? I think that's where we get stuck, right? Yeah. You think about, I'll come back to this maybe, but so there are atoms that we can say exist and molecules, and there's and there are tables, but is the table made out of atoms? Does a table come to be through the aggregation out there, independently of us and our world, just through all these little parts come together, and then there's a table. And some Buddhist systems would say, yeah, exactly. That's, Vaibhashika, for example, would say, there's tables, but they're just conventions, because they're made out of little tiny things. And those little tiny things are real, but, then, we just impute a convention of table on top of it, right? But that's not the Prasangika way to say, well, the atoms are only conventionally existent and the table is only conventionally existent. All of these things are merely designated or imputed by the mind. If you're thinking that the table is just set out up from its own side, apart from you, because there's certain atoms that exist there, then you're not really getting at what the Prasangika view is, right? I think we do, well, reflexively, we do tend to think of that. I mean, when you think about it, it's like, how is a Prasangika view as interpreted by Tsongkhapa really different from our everyday ordinary view? Because he's saying we're going to preserve conventional truths. So, some Gyaltsen has said, yeah, we got conventional truths, conventional valid cognition. Everything we already believe in is true. And yet there's this extra thing called emptiness. It's like, so what's the problem? Emptiness is just this fluidity that makes the conventional world work. It's like, no, that's not really right. Because our ordinary conventional sense of how things exist is overlaid with this delusion that things have this ability to exist and set themselves objectively from their own side, apart from our minds. And they can't do that. They can't do that. They depend upon imputation by mind. Why? How do I know? Because it's only a table when we're a human being. I'm not talking about different words, jokse or, mesa or table. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, table, whatever you call it in any language, it exists as a useful convention for human beings, but not so much for spiders, And, that's because they have that funky spider karma, and they don't know a table when they see it. No, that's not right. If they saw the world with the kinds of objects in it that we see, then they would be mentally disturbed spiders. They're living in the same space and time where we are, and correctly perceiving relative to their minds and bodies, different objects, right? You can even tell that when you go for a walk with your dogs. And there's all kinds of things that they're very, very interested in, which are completely invisible to us, and vice versa, right? So now I'm gonna, let me see how I'm doing on time. Now I'm gonna do my quotes from Tsongkhapa. Good, I have some time. So these are quotes from a great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment, where Tsongkhapa is actually gonna pin down what exactly does he mean by delusion, and what does he mean by, intrinsic existence that's imagined by delusion. Okay, there is, with regard to objects, a conception that things have a way of existing, an ontological status, in and of themselves, without being posited through the force of an awareness. The object of that conception is self, or intrinsic nature. And he says hypothetical, because this doesn't actually exist. But it's like, yeah, it's an imaginary, object of that conception, right? There's something on the side of objects themselves that allows them to be there, apart from being labeled by our minds. To exist intrinsically or autonomously means having its own unique manner of being. This is what Tsongkhapa says. Its own unique manner of being, like independently of its relationship to a perspective. So this is how Tsongkhapa tries to explain that. This is still, quote, Take the case of an imaginary snake mistakenly ascribed to a rope. Well, of course, everybody does take it, right? It's happened. It never happened to me. I don't know how many times it's happened to you, but yeah, there's very many detailed uses of the imaginary snake that's been mistakenly ascribed to a rope, especially if the rope is kind of, has a mottled color and there's not adequate lighting and so forth. And perhaps there are a lot of poisonous snakes around in India. And then people are thinking, might be a snake, right? Common philosophical example. So this is what Tsongkhapa does with it, which is completely different from any other, what I've seen anybody else do with it. He says, if we set aside now how the snake is ascribed from the perspective apprehending the snake, and we just say, forget about how, it's imputedly existent. Let's forget about that. And we'll try to analyze just what the snake is in terms of its own nature, apart from, mind, independently of being ascribed by the mind. There isn't any snake there in the rope, so its features cannot be analyzed. You can't discuss what the snake is like in and of itself, apart from the way it's ascribed as being present by the mind that's mistaking the rope as a snake, right? That's his point. It's like the mind is necessarily involved. So this is still Tsongkhapa. He says, like that, suppose we're to leave aside any analysis of how things appear to our ordinary eyes and ears and so forth, right? And instead we say, okay, forget about how they appear to our minds, how they appear to dogs' minds, how they appear to ghosts' minds or God's minds. And we'll forget about all that and just say, well, what are they like in and of themselves, apart from how they appear to all these different kinds of beings, right? How do they exist then? They're not established in any way. There's nothing that you can pin down or say about them when you set them apart from perspectives. And ignorance, delusion, this false superimposition that's the root of cyclic existence, it's that which, instead of seeing this, that things aren't established apart from, dependence on a perspective, it looks at each and everything as though it had a way of existing so that it could be known in and of itself without being posited through the force of a conventional awareness. This is what Tsongkhapa's way of saying that everything that exists conventionally exists because everything that exists is posited through the force of a conventional awareness. You can't just say, if you get rid of conventional awareness, you get rid of existence altogether. So this means that everything that exists as a mere imputation or designation, or is merely labeled. Everything exists as this or as that, as a table or so forth, only insofar as it is this or that relative to a perspective that's free from superficial error. In other words, if I've been taking a lot of psilocybin, or if I, if I'm being tricked by an optical illusion, right? There's, or I think that there's somebody over there because I'm hearing an echo of my own voice. I'm right. There's so many different kinds of things where, right, you can see, oh, there's water over there at the other end of the parking lot in the summer a lot of time, right? Which is, of course, not really water, but it kind of looks like as a pool of water and so forth, right? So there's many, many ways in which external circumstances around us or internal, problems with our sense powers or mind cause us to have a perspective which, is what Chandrakirti calls a superficial cause of error. So it puts us, out of line with a conventionally correct perspective on seeing tables as tables as human beings, right? Right. So, yeah. Tables aren't made out of atoms. They're imputed in relationship to a basis of designation that, not objectively, but for that particular kind of being, is an appropriate basis in relationship to designate a table. So if a spider came along and was thinking this was a table, then that would probably be, I mean, I don't know, it's either a very spiritually advanced spider that has clairvoyantly understands my perspective, or else it has some kind of superficial error in its spider mind, right? If I were going around seeing everything in this room the way spiders see it, then there would be a problem, right? So with my, I would have superficial error, right? Yeah, in my human faculties. So everything is what it can is designated or this or that relative to how it appears, you know, to certain kinds of beings. So Tsongkhapa and His Holiness say that while dependent and arising and emptiness, things don't exist except in dependence on one another. Things are empty of having their own intrinsic nature. Well, they have the same meaning. They cash out the same. It's actually very difficult in practice to maintain confidence in dependent arising as, you know, cause and effect, that what we do makes a difference, for example, while also at the same time holding in mind this subtle meaning of emptiness, that things are devoid of having any nature that's not a mere imputation. In other words, it starts to feel like when you meditate on how everything's a mere imputation, it can start to feel like you're undermining the sense of that cause and effect could actually work. And it takes, a lot. It's logical, right? But it's hard to actually practically hold in the mind both of these understandings at the same time. But we should try to do it, because this is what, you know, we're taught is the wisdom that opens the prison door of cyclic existence. So another thing I wanted to say, and I don't think I said this last time, because I've talked about imputation, designation. I've used the FPMT word, labeling. These words do not refer to wrong consciousnesses. These words are used in English to talk about the appropriate assignment of conventional identity. You know, that I impute this as a glass, and I impute this as a laptop, and this is a table, and these are what they are, because relative, it's a correct imputation relative to a human point of view. And so it's not saying that that's the problem. It's not, the imputation word is not the word that's being used to talk about the slathering of extra ontological mayonnaise onto the top of things. Everything exists as a mere imputation. There isn't any other way for anything to exist at all. So if we weren't doing any imputing, then we wouldn't exist, and nothing else would exist aside from imputation. The other word that people get mixed up with imputation is superimposition. So superimposition is the word we're using to talk about the action of delusion or ignorance, and plastering over or plastering into our perceptions and to our thoughts this extra deceptive layer of apparent reality that never has existed and never could. And that apparent reality is the idea of things, having their own way of being apart from the perspective of any particular mind at all. Or, there's other types of superimposition too, superimposing things as existing apart from their parts, or superimposing things as not needing to depend on causes and conditions and so forth. But the subtlest one is this, superimposing the idea that things can exist without depending on a conventional consciousness that's perceiving them as that. That's what Tsongkhapa says. Subtlest superimposition is the basis of cyclic existence, is the superimposition of things as existing without needing to be imputed by a conventional mind. Exactly. So anyway, I just brought that up because I know that it's easy to get him confused and think that when we're imputing things, we're making a mistake. And it could be that in some Buddhist systems that the word is used that way. Something is merely imputed means it's not real. And then they're going to tell you later that there is some other thing that is real. But that's not the way it is in Prasangika. It's not the way it is for Chandrakirti. It's not the way it is for Tsongkhapa or the Dalai Lama. Everything that exists is merely imputed. That's how things exist, right? And thinking that they have more existence than that is the superimposition that causes cyclic existence. So in the Prasangika system, Chandrakirti and Tsongkhapa, emptiness means that the object of designation or imputation, like the table or chair, right, or person, is not going to be found in relationship to its basis of designation. So, you know, there's a big flat white wide surface across from me behind the laptop, and you know, it definitely presents itself to my mind as a wall, but there's, you know, certain shape, certain color there, and that basis, that's a certain size, I guess you could say. You can have a microscopic wall, and so certain shape, size, color, and in relationship to those, I am appropriately, as best I know, right, imputing wall, and right, and we'll say that's what it means for it to be a wall, is that's a correct imputation. But if I go over and say, look among the shapes and colors and sizes that are appearing to my mind, and saying, okay, is that the wall? Is this the wall? Is this the wall? Is that the wall? You can never find anything that is the wall out there, even conventionally, on the side of the object. Even conventionally. This is important, right? And this is a subtle distinction within Madhyamaka, you know, the people who follow Nagarjuna. Some people say, well, conventionally, fire is hot, but of course, ultimately, you know, nothing's hot and nothing's cold, just like the Heart Sutra says. You know, ultimately, nothing's hot and nothing's cold. But conventionally, you know, we want to say that on the side of fire, there's a nature, it has its own nature of hotness conventionally, right? And Chandrakirti wants to not say that, because it doesn't have, even conventionally, any fixed nature on its own side. Now, that's what it means to say that it's merely designated. And definitely is hard to get our minds around, right? Honestly, I'll tell you that I have known, you know, not great scholars, but I've known Gyaltsen monks who privately told me that they have had a hard time, you know, because they were serious and seriously trying to understand how things can be merely conventionally designated and yet still function. And they found that in order to hold their confidence in karma in their minds, they resorted to a svatantrika view, and that is to say, well, things are ultimately empty, but conventionally, you know, the cat has a nature of being a cat and not a hat on its own side, right? And that's why it's appropriate to call it a cat, because it is a cat, right, out there, apart from my mind. Do you see what I'm saying? And that's not the final view that Tsongkhapa adopts. But of course, the instruction is like, oh, we don't necessarily, the highest view is not necessarily the best medicine for everybody. And if meditating on the highest view undermines your confidence, you know, that what you do makes a difference in the world, then yeah, it's better. There's better medicine. There's lots of better medicine for you that's available in the Dharma pharmacy. Let me see what I'm doing. Starting around time. Therefore, this is also Tsongkhapa. Things exist only conventionally, and to exist conventionally means to exist. To exist means existing conventionally. This is the same thing. Nothing exists that doesn't exist conventionally. Conventionally existing means that things exist. It doesn't mean that things don't exist, but just falsely or assumed to. That's what existence is conventional existence. So conventional existence doesn't mean majority rule. It's like people can think at a certain point in time that certain kinds of social practices are ethically correct. And even if 95% of the people agree with that, it may be that it's just a matter of time before further investigation, right? Further investigation of the human condition will reveal that these are actually completely inappropriate, right? Yeah. I don't know, sexism comes to my mind as a good example. So what does it mean for things? If conventional existence is not, what things exist conventionally is not a matter of majority rule, well, what is it then? And Tsongkhapa says, this is him speaking, we hold that something exists conventionally. One, if it's known to a conventional mind, and there has to be a conventional mind that is thinking about molecules, atoms, the Big Bang, and so forth. Also, if there's no other conventional reliable cognition that can come along and contradict its being as thus known, right? So if we think that there's we can see water over there in the parking lot. And so we think that water over there in the parking lot is known to conventional minds. So maybe it exists conventionally. But then when I go up closer, I can see that it's actually not. It's just the heat coming off the tarmac, right? Then it's discredited by this other conventional, reliable cognition. And so it's not actually conventionally existent as water. And also the third criterion is if reason that accurately analyzes reality, that looks into the question of whether things have their own intrinsic nature or not, doesn't contradict it. In other words, we may think that things exist by way of their own nature, right? And we may not be able to use our ordinary conventional minds to see that they don't. But if a mind of ultimate analysis that reasons into the question of what is these things really, that can discredit the idea that things exist in and of themselves. So you have this conventional existence. This is an important idea. In some Buddhist systems, what things are known and what things exist conventionally is determined by way of a kind of matching up of the intrinsic characteristics of the object out there with the perception in here. And if my perception of it matches its intrinsic characteristics out there, then that's pramana, that's sema, that's like a conventional valid cognition. It's a reliable knowledge because there's a match between the intrinsic qualities of the object and what's going on in my mind. And you notice that here Tsongkhapa defines what conventional existence is without talking about the nature of the object at all. He's just saying if it's something that appears to a conventional mind, it's not contradicted by conventional reliable cognition. And if it's not contradicted by ultimate analysis, then we're going to say that it conventionally exists. It's like you have this big pie of, instead of saying, things exist conventionally, if we can make a match, right, between the objective characteristics of the object and the subjective perception. No, you're saying, here's all these things that we think we see. Now we're going to subtract from that big pie the ones that are discredited by conventional investigation, the ones that are discredited by ultimate investigation. So anything, this is Tsongkhapa, what fails to meet those three criteria does not exist. So what this means is that because there isn't any essential nature at all, A prasangika madhyamaka theory of reliable knowledge has to mean that whatever it is that we suppose we know may later have to be revised. This should be obvious, right? Because we think when a person is seeing, maybe, because we're experienced, we often will see what looks like water at the edge of the hot parking lot and immediately discredit the possibility that that's really water, right? But when we vividly see an optical illusion, right, we may actually suppose that, that one line is longer than the other, or one ball is bigger than another when they're set up in a way to fool our eye sense power, right? We feel that we have conventional, reliable knowledge about what's actually there, right? But it turns out on closer investigation with holding up a ruler, for example, that the one line and the other line are exactly the same length, and our eye was just being fooled. So yeah, or it could be that there were a lot of people who thought that it was self-evident that women were gay men in Tibetan, inferior class of beings, and they just had bad karma, and that was just self-evident, right? But it turns, they were wrong. It wasn't like because a lot of people thought that, then that was conventional knowledge. It was never conventional knowledge. It was just something that a lot of people thought, and they thought when they thought it that it was conventional knowledge. But it turned out, upon further exploration of the human condition, that this is discredited, that they were wrong about that, right? So conventional knowledge is always a work in progress, right? We're always taking in new information and deciding how reliable it is by seeing how well it fits with the other things that we already think are true, right? And sometimes we come upon some information which causes us to totally revise a whole bunch of things that in the past we thought were true, right? Because there isn't any intrinsic essence in things that we can check, the objective quality of things and match it up. Then can be absolutely sure that our conventional knowledge is correct. Yeah. So conventional knowledge can always be improved and progressively corrected. And this is what His Holiness says. If scientific analysis were to conclusively demonstrate that certain claims of Buddhism are false, then we must accept the findings of science and abandon those claims, right? So he said various other things about that too, that Buddha taught various things about the distance of the moon and so forth in terms of, what people believed at that time, right? And so that could be skillful, but the idea is that, right, that our conventional understanding of things is revisable, and that has to be revised in the light of further understanding. And this right, matches up this idea of progressive improvement of conventional knowledge. It matches up to the scientific method, that evolutionary process in which hypotheses and conjectures are imaginatively proposed and then tested in order to explain facts or solve problems. That's what science is. So you come up with ideas about what seems to be going on over there at the end of the parking lot, and you might think that you're right, and then you might later find out that you're wrong, right? Yeah. And that's important. The idea that our conventional knowledge can be improved matches up, to the scientific method, and also to the idea of a lamarim, of a gradual path, gradual transformation of the mind culminated in awakening. You can't talk about a gradual transformation of the mind culminating in awakening unless you have the idea that progress or improvement of what we take to be conventional knowledge is actually possible. And I'm sort of throwing in a little point here, is that if you take the point of view that profound view number 2 takes, is that we're all perfectly awakened Buddhas already, right? Then you have to come up with a different way of explaining, what's going on the spiritual path, right? Because there can't actually be any progressive improvement, right, in our basic condition. So there's congruence between the scientific method and the successive refinement that takes place in the step-by-step mind training. This is my point. Let me see, I have to stop. So through attentive conventional practice, we can gradually become better at doing stuff. We can become more effective in promoting happiness. We can improve our conventional understanding of how to treat COVID, right? All the concepts, stories, maps, ideas, strategies, approaches, they're never exactly going to, represent the world and match up. And Prasangika, the Chandrakirti Tsongkhapa view is that, in fact, there never is any natural way that the world out there, apart from our perspective, just is in itself. That's an illusion. And so what we need to do is to develop models or stories or practices, patterns of behavior that are more and more conducive, or more and more effective, more conducive to healing and transformation, rather than focusing on how well they match to some objective reality. The question is, how effective are they, right? So, as I said, conventional reality is not majority rule. We can always improve our way of being doctors or scientists or spiritual teachers and become more and more attuned, in our way of responding to situations. Yeah. Everything's equally empty. That doesn't mean that it doesn't make a difference. It makes a big difference what choices we make moment by moment, right? Yeah. There's only it's only these empty things that work. It's because of emptiness, allowing this openness and fluidity, that there's improper and proper conduct, right? There's better and worse ways of doing things in terms of the outcomes of liberation that we seek, right? Because all things are ultimately empty. I'm sure you don't have any questions about that, right? I know it's a little more complicated than last time. I took you right into Lamrim Chemo there. That's the view that Tsongkhapa expresses. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you explain the literal meaning of the conventional truth from the Tibetan, Kunzup Tenpa?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Gunzo means all puffed up, something like that. Very literally. Zop is sort of like a loaf of bread. Gunzop. Zop means like something that's puffed up, looks bigger than it is. You know what I'm saying? Like something that's inflated. So it looks big, but it isn't really, right? And gun means all, totally, right? So it's like totally inflated. This is very, very literal, etymological. Gunzo, totally inflated. And then Demba, of course, means truth, right? Or could be reality. Usually we say truth, right? So that's what it literally means. It means something that's like inflated so as to appear to be existing in a certain way, when in fact it doesn't really exist that way. Right? So Gunzo Demba has so Gunzo Demba is, which is the usual word for conventional truth, it has a connotation, or etymological meaning that points to the fact that these things are appearing to us deceptively. Gunzop, they appear as though they exist from their own side, but they don't really. Yeah. In Tsongkhapa's system, Gonzo Demba is synonymous with Tanya Demba, which means even more literally, conventional truth or transactionally, reliable truth. So Tsongkhapa is not saying that conventional truths are non-deceptive. The very word that is used, implies that we don't see them as they are. Gonzo, yeah. There's an element of deceptiveness. And I kind of alluded to this, in the Gyaltsen tradition, Tsongkhapa was very clear about all these things exist, but they don't exist the way they appear. And when he talked about defining conventional truth, he even included the word deceptive in his definition, that these are things that, appear to ordinary minds in a way other than how they are, okay? But as the Gyaltsen tradition went on and became, a major force in history of Tibet, this kind of like emphasis on the deceptiveness of conventional truth started to be sort of pushed a little bit to the background relative to the stress on the reliableness of conventional truth, right? And then you sort of get this idea that I was kind of playing with there a little bit, is like, all these conventional truths exist. Tables exist, chairs exist, all these things exist. And so, yeah, and there's this other thing called emptiness, but it doesn't really change the fact that all these things that I'm seeing right now exist. So no problem. Do you know what I'm saying? And then you end up with no real insight, right? And I'm pointing to kind of like a pitfall that good Gyaltsen scholars have pointed out about their own tradition, that in working so hard to avoid leading people into nihilism, they kind of can go in the direction of not really challenging people's like deluded belief that things exist the way they appear. Yeah.
Dr. Newland?
Yes.
Hi, this is Jackie Fan from San Francisco.
Jackie, I see you. Your
Yes.
black square over there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I have difficult in understanding what you meant by or what Prasangika say, like emptiness means that object of designation is not found in relation to its basis of designation, even conventionally. So even conventionally.
Yeah, I know. It is hard to understand. You're right. Yeah. Right. Well, let's put it this way. Like all the other systems in, including Svatantrika Madhyamaka, say that when you designate, let's do person, when you designate the aggregates of mind and body as a person, there has to be something, at least conventionally, that's in there among the aggregates that is the person conventionally, right? So in, Bhava Viveka, the Svatantrika view could be the Bhava Viveka version of the Svatantrika view would be the mental consciousness is what we mean by the person conventionally. Now, the person is designated in relationship to this collection of aggregates, but it's an appropriate thing because of the presence of the mental consciousness moving from lifetime to lifetime in a continuum, functioning as the basis of the designation of the person. So, right. The idea is if there isn't something within the basis of designation that has the core nature or function that's associated with the object designated, that it can't be an appropriate designation. This is how the other systems perceive it. And what Prasangika is trying to do is to say that there are external objects, but they don't have any intrinsic characteristics of being this or that, except relative particular minds that are apprehending them. And therefore, there isn't anything that's within the basis of designation that even conventionally can be pinned down as like, that's the, in other words, there's no essential nature even conventionally. For Prasangika, the idea of an essential nature is contradictory to the idea of something existing conventionally. The idea is that if in Prasangika, Chandrakirti, if something had its own essential nature, then when you looked and said, what is that thing really? You would find that essential nature. And then that would be an ultimately real thing. Do you see what I'm saying? And so, you know, Chandrakirti and Tsongkhapa see the idea of essential natures that exist only conventionally as a contradiction. Yeah, that could clarify it a little bit, but I mean, we'll have to talk about it more next week. I mean, the question could be, is fire hot or not? Right? This is a good example, right? This is like, is fire hot or not? It's like, doesn't it conventionally have over there on the side of fire some hotness? You could think about it as like, yeah, it's a challenge, right? To hold a Prasangika view in your mind. It's like, well, yeah, it's hot relative to whose perception, right? It's not objectively intrinsically hot. It's hot for some kinds of beings. Might not be hot. If a hell being got a hold of some of our fire, they might say, thank Buddha, I finally got a break. I don't know. I'm just saying, or, you know, water, you know, we have, right? Certain qualities of that, but it's not the same qualities that are perceived by these little water skeeters that zip across the surface. For them, you know, water's like a table or a plane, or, do you know what I'm saying? And it's like, I look up at a dangerous cliff, you know, and the rocky ledge, and I think, holy shit, you know, there's no way I would ever want to be up there. And then there's this goat up there that's like very, very happy because it's the only place that's safe from a predator. And you just keep going like that. You think about like, there's creatures who live at the bottom of the sea very, very happily under conditions that we would find, like, you know, at temperatures that we would find extremely hot, such that they were not compatible with sustaining life, and at pressures that are, right? And so what's a good place to be? What's a good place to be? What's really hot? It's not something that can be established as being, it seems self-evident to us because we're just taking our point of view as normative. But there's so many different kinds of minds and perspectives in the universe.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Newland.
Yeah, I'm gonna, so what I'll start with next time is I'm gonna take, you know, my way of trying to explain or interpret what it means to say everything that exists is a mere imputation. I'm going to try to take my way of explaining that, how that fits with the idea that there are also external objects, how that fits with the idea that there is a distinction between good actions and bad actions. I'm going to try to like explain that just point by point by point, right? So we've laid the groundwork for that. That's what I'll do for the first part of next class. And then after that, we can, you know, migrate into the other views, right? Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention. I see somebody. Are there things that I should be responding to other than the people who spoke? Somebody, Snehi, raised her hand. People have
yes,
written.
but I think we're past time, so I don't want to keep you, but I will just add my question to your list of questions for next week.
Okay.
Which is on, you were talking about, you know, how Tsongkhapa has 3 rules to establish conventional existence. And I always have trouble with that because I always feel like, whose convention, you know, and just to take like death penalty, like, you know, like half of us say yes, half of us say no. Some say, well, it depends on context.
Yeah.
I agree. You know, so I don't really know like how to make sense of that in day-to-day life.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that next time. And yeah, we've probably done enough for tonight. Yeah. I see. Okay. Well, we're over time, so I don't want to keep you later, but thank you all for your attentiveness. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you again a week from now. Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Good
I enjoyed
night.
doing it. Okay. Bye.
Bye.